Good evening. Welcome to our Fall Chamber and Symphonic Concert. This year's group has selected Russell Catania as our program notes chair, and before he comes out to discuss the pieces that we are performing tonight, I want to say a few words about him and the function of program notes. First, as I'm sure you'll hear from Russell in a few moments, we are performing music tonight from many different centuries and musical time periods. Although this is not Severance Hall or Carnegie Hall, I feel that the students should not only act as though they are in a professional setting, but also try to express the opposing nuances from each of the time periods that we have chosen to perform from. If you have not attended a Cleveland Orchestra concert recently, I beg you, please attend one this season. The Cleveland Orchestra is easily one of the best orchestras in the entire world, and it's a shame that it's not mentioned more often as one of the bright spots of the city that we live in. Also, if you do attend, try to make it to the program notes before the concert begins. I promise you will not be bored, and it will really give you a more specific context of the sound that you'll be hearing that evening. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Russell Catania. Russell is a cellist in both Mannheim and Symphony, as well as a state champion in speech and debate. Russell is a member of Top 25, Men's Choir, and is also one of the lead roles in this year's musical. Please help me in welcoming Russell Catania to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Like Mr. Yoke said, my name is Russell Catania. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Just going to give a little brief summary on some of the pieces we're going to be performing this evening. Tonight's concert, like Mr. Yoke said, is going to be full of some very wide varieties of time periods, which is a pretty new endeavor for our orchestra, and I'm really excited about it. A lot of contemporary music that you're going to be hearing tonight. But because of my 8-minute time period with you all, I'm only going to go through 2 pieces as to not put any of you to sleep. So one of the first pieces we're going to be looking at today, just for a moment, is Mozart's Eine kleine Nacht music. We're going to be performing the first 3 movements this evening. Mozart is a very popular composer. There's probably not a person in this room that hasn't heard the name Mozart. And with a first name like Wolfgang, he was pretty destined to write some of the most important musical literature in our history. A fun fact about Mozart, when he was baptized as a child, he was actually baptized under the name Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart. But on the way to becoming a child prodigy, he shortened that. So Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is what we're left with. Mozart favored the piano, but he did bear to write some very important symphonic works for us. Though he detested the violin, he played it very well and ended up writing numerous symphonies, concertos for the string ensembles and orchestras. So he really blew the minds of many classical era composers, some listeners, and it was a really inspirational time period while Mozart was writing. By the age of 5, he was a traveling musician. He was on tours, being paid, and by the age of 9, he had started his first full symphony. I rode my bike at age 9, but he was writing symphonies, so just remember that. Eine kleine Nacht music was being written by Mozart while he was composing the second act of his famous opera Don Giovanni. So as a recap, one of the most famous serenades in history was written on commission in his downtime between writing an opera, Wolfgang. So it's very, a lot of his serenades were written on commission, which means, someone paid him to start where they left off as a composer, and he was paid some money, but the first performance of this piece was never recorded, and so we don't really remember, the classical era composers don't really remember when he got famous, but this piece really wasn't published until quite some time after when it became famous. The little serenade we're going to be playing today was originally written for 2 violins, a viola, a cello, and a double bass, but it is very often played by an entire string orchestra just for kicks and giggles. It does sound very nice when there's a whole orchestra behind it. It's one of the most recognizable pieces of music in literature history. And you'll recognize it when Mr. Yoke gives us the downbeat for the first movement. It is as famous that I don't need to sing it for you this evening, so I'll just save it for the orchestra. So the first movement, like I said, one of the most recognizable. It's set up in a sonata allegro form, which is very common for many of his sonatas. And so the second theme, after we get out of this sonata allegro form, is going to be in D major, which shifts from the dominant G major, which is what the piece starts in. So it's a nice transition into the exposition, and then the development repeats. And it actually repeats after the exposition again. So you'll hear that same theme towards the end of the piece, signifying that we're nearing the end and then getting ready for the second movement. And we hear that G major recapitulation again as the first movement comes to a close. And then the second movement, which is called the Romance, is in C major. The tempo is marked Andante. It's very smooth. You're going to get a very nice feeling of tenderness, intimacy during the movement, very slow. And, you know, it's going to be one of those movements that really takes you away from the impact of the first movement. It kind of lets you settle down a little bit. It feels, you know, like I said, very tender, and so you're not going to get that dynamic, that push you feel in the first movement. So it's a nice contrast that Mozart brings into the piece. The third movement, which is a trio, is also in a minuet form. So it's going to be 3/4 time, which is different than the first and second movement, which is in 4/4 time. You'll hear that distinction. The minuet is in the key of G major, while the contrasting trio is in the key of D major. You're going to hear that distinction about halfway through the piece when the trio begins. And then, because this piece is a minuet trio, it's going to go back into the minuet, and it's called da capo. It's going to start back in the beginning and then end right before the trio would start again. So those are the three movements we're going to be performing for the Mozart. Mannheim is going to be opening with that. Symphony Orchestra is going to be closing with a piece by Aaron Copland. Not Copland, that's a comedian. Aaron Copland is an American composer, writer. Later in his career, he would go to be a conductor for many of his own pieces and other American music. My fun fact about Aaron Copland is in 1936, to prove to his father he was not a Democrat, he voted for the Communist Party USA, and then rubbed it in his father's face. I don't know, I just love that. Nothing to do with music. The piece we're going to be playing this evening is from a ballad he wrote. I'm sorry, a ballet ballad. Okay, so a ballet he wrote called Rodeo. This rodeo was broken up into 5 parts, but the symphonic arrangement is only broken up into 4. It leaves out the 3rd part of the ballet. And so the part we're going to be playing this evening is called Hoedown. This is the finale of the ballet and is also the finale of the symphonic arrangement. So Hoedown, you're immediately going to get this feeling, very westernized jig, and you're going to get that the moment the piece starts. And that's something that Copland wanted to incorporate into the finale of his ballet. If you've ever seen the ballet, it's one of his most finest works, and I have watched it personally, and the choreography is phenomenal as well. But back to the symphonic arrangement. So like I said, it leaves out the ranch house party, which is the 3rd portion. This movement is very high energy. So it's going to depict a lot of dancing. You're going to see a lot of violin showdowns, a lot of fiddler-like riffs and stuff like that. It's going to be very interesting. It's a piece where you really should imagine what's going on. So you're going to be sitting in your seats this evening, and I want you to try to actually picture that jig happening. Watch. You'll hear in the very beginning, you're going to hear the fiddlers tuning. You're going to hear them warming up to start showing off their mad fiddler skills. And that's very common in a 1930s hoedown, which is exactly when he wrote his ballet. And he did not create the symphonic arrangement. However, someone did translate his ballet into a symphonic arrangement, and it depicts very accurately what he wanted to depict inside of his ballet. So you're going to hear this jig, you're going to hear a lot of violins and violas going back and forth at each other. And it's very entertaining once you understand what's actually happening in this piece. These violins, first violins, second violins, violas, combating each other and saying, I'm better than you, and trying to one-up the other section. And you'll hear slightly through the piece, near its end, you're going to hear the record player that's playing this piece start to wind down in the form of a trumpet solo, which you'll hear at the close of this piece. And it's left up to the string orchestra to wind that record player back up and keep his piece moving. And you're going to hear the piece close in that same joyful and energetic style and in which it came. So like I said, please just try to imagine actually what's going on in the hoedown, because it's much more interesting to hear what you're imagining inside of the piece. And that's something that Copeland wanted to incorporate in his ballet, and that's something that the arranger for this symphonic arrangement wanted to bring also into the piece as well. Thank you so much for sitting with us for a little bit. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your support this evening. Mr. Yoke deliberately made this concert the way it was. He wanted to teach us a lot about contemporary works, and I think that's very important. We did focus a lot on some very classical pieces, and I think it's very important that we understand the two concepts between contemporary and classical and the styles in between. And the two orchestras here tonight have learned a lot from the two styles we are going to depict to you today in this concert. So thank you very much. Just as a reminder, our orchestra fundraiser is happening this evening at the Dairy Queen on Lakeshore Boulevard. So please, I beg you, give us money by giving yourself ice cream. These Mentor parents that are helping with this orchestra are amazing people, and they put on this fundraiser, and I don't think anyone pays them. Mrs. Clark, no one pays them. So please, just go support us on Lakeshore Boulevard right after the concert. Go swing by. And thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Hope you enjoy the show tonight.
Thank